The air in the penthouse suite of the St. Jude's Wing for patrons was not the air of a hospital, but of a mausoleum built to worship wealth. It was a sterile, cold atmosphere, filtered to clinical perfection and scented with a faint metallic tang of ozone from the humming machines that lines the walls like silent, chrome-plated sentinels. Beneath that, a deeper, more subtle scent lingered, the smell of old money, of leather-bound portfolios and custom-tailored suits, an aroma of power so profound it seemed to have seeped into the very marble of the floors. Light from the floor-to-ceiling windows poured in, illuminating a panoramic view of the city below, a sprawling kingdom of glass and steel that seemed to bow before this room. The only sound, apart from the rhythmic sigh and beep of the monitors, was the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of a mop gliding across the polished floor. A sound so mundane it was functionally silent in a space designed to insulate its occupants from the realities of the common world. It was the sound of invisibility, the sound of a ghost tending to a gilded cage. The ghost's name was Mateo Vargas. To the world within these walls, he was nothing more than a uniform, a pair of hands, and a quiet deference that bordered on non-existence. His movements were a study in efficiency, a ballet of practiced economy learned over years of making himself small. The way he dipped the mop, the precise arc of his swing that left no streaks, the gentle way he maneuvered his cart so its wheels never squeaked, it was all part of a carefully constructed camouflage. He was a piece of the architecture, as unremarkable as a light fixture or a power outlet. But inside the quiet vessel of the janitor, a different man lived and breathed. Inside, there was a mind that could name every plant in the Amazon basin by its Latin binomial, a memory that held the precise chemical compositions of 1,000 natural toxins and their antidotes, and a heart that carried the weight of a drowned valley and the ghosts of a forgotten people. He was Dr. Mateo Vargas, PhD candidate in ethnobotany, a prodigy whose life's work had been buried under a landslide of toxic sludge. Every sterile scent in this room was a phantom limb, a painful echo of a world he had lost. The antiseptic cleaner reminded him of the sharp, clean fragrance of the yerba luisa leaves his grandmother would crush to make tea. The low hum of the air filtration system was a hollow mockery of the vibrant thrum of insect life that once filled the nights in the Valle de la Sombra, his home. He mopped the floor, but his mind walked along the banks of the Rio Claro, a river that once ran so pure you could see the colored stones on its bed. He saw the cerulean flash of a kingfisher diving for its meal. He felt the cool, clean water on his skin. And then, as it always did, the memory soured. The image of the river shifted, turning thick and gray, coated with a chemical sheen that reflected the sky like a dead eye. He saw his younger sister, Elena, her breath growing shallow, her skin a pallid gray that matched the poisoned water. He was here, in this temple of wealth, scrubbing floors for men who owned the world, so he could send a few $100s a month to the handful of elders from his village who had survived, now scattered and living in poverty, their roots cut and their future erased. The sterile tranquility of the suite was shattered not by a sound but by a presence. The door swept open with a pneumatic hiss, and the room was suddenly filled with a flurry of motion and muted panic. A team of doctors and nurses, their faces grim and set, pushed a gurney into the center of the room. On it, half covered by a sheet of the finest Egyptian cotton, was Don Lorenzo Falcone. Even in the throes of a medical crisis, he radiated an aura of absolute, inviolable authority. His silver hair was disheveled, his $1,000 suit was rumpled, and a sheen of cold sweat covered his ashen face. But his eyes were still the eyes of a hawk. They darted around the room, not with fear, but with incandescent rage, as if the universe itself had committed a personal offense against him by allowing this to happen. He was a king brought low, and his fury at the indignity was more potent than any fear of death. His entourage, a collection of men in dark suits with anxious faces, hovered near the door, speaking in hushed, urgent tones into their phones, trying to manage an empire while its emperor was collapsing. Mateo instinctively retreated, melting back into the shadows of the room, his cart a shield between him and the chaos. He continued his work, his movements slow and deliberate, a small island of calm in a sea of emergency. The doctors worked feverishly, their voices a low murmur of medical jargon. Words floated through the air: neurotoxin, rapid paralysis, respiratory failure. Then a younger doctor, holding a tablet with a picture displayed on its screen, spoke the words that stopped Mateo's heart. He identified the source of the poison, the creature that had bitten the Don during a hostile negotiation disguised as a gift exchange. The name felt alien in the sterile room, a word from another world, another life. Vipera oscura, the dark viper of the Shadow Valley. A serpent that existed nowhere else on Earth but the now barren mountainsides of his home. A cold dread, heavy and absolute, settled in Mateo's stomach.
The world shrank until it was only him, the dying man on the bed, and the ghost of a snake that tied their fates together across a chasm of decades and a river of death. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The chief of medicine, a man with a reputation for godlike infallibility, shook his head, his face a mask of professional despair. "There is no antidote," he declared, his voice heavy with the finality of a death sentence. "The venom is too complex, too fast-acting. We can only make him comfortable." A wave of despair washed over Falcone's men. But for Falcone himself, despair was an unaffordable luxury. His rage intensified, a desperate, burning fire against the encroaching cold. His gaze swept the room, searching for something, anything, to lash out at, a target for the venom in his own soul. And then his eyes landed on Mateo, quietly humming a tune from his childhood, a mournful, wordless melody that had surfaced from his subconscious as a balm for the sudden turmoil in his heart. Falcone's lip curled into a sneer. "What is that noise?" he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "That peasant groaning, it's grating on my nerves." The words struck Mateo with the force of a physical blow. Peasant groaning. That song was not a groan. It was a lullaby his mother had sung to him. It was the melody the village sang during the harvest, a song of gratitude to the earth for its bounty. It was the tune Elena had hummed as she wove flower crowns from wild orchids. In one contemptuous phrase, Falcone had taken the entire vibrant, living culture of the Valle de la Sombra, all its beauty and all its pain, and dismissed it as worthless noise. The insult resonated with a deeper, more profound violation. It was the same dismissive arrogance that had allowed a man like Falcone to look at a map, point to a valley teeming with life, and see only a convenient, empty place to dump his industrial poison. A cold fury, different from any anger he had ever known, began to solidify in Mateo's veins. It was not hot and reckless, but glacial and precise. His hands, holding the handle of the mop, became perfectly still. His breath, once shallow with shock, deepened, becoming slow and controlled. Falcone, oblivious to the transformation he had just triggered, turned his fury on the chief of medicine. "Can't you get this filth out of here?" he barked, gesturing weakly toward Mateo with a flick of his wrist, an act of dismissal that carried the weight of 1,000 such dismissals over a lifetime of unquestioned power. "His pathetic superstitions are probably making me sicker." The word hung in the air. Filth. The same word used to describe the chemical waste. The same sentiment used to justify the erasure of his people. The doctors exchanged uncomfortable glances, eager to placate their dying benefactor. A junior physician took a hesitant step toward Mateo, ready to ask him to leave. But Mateo didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, the mop held in his hand, not like a tool, but like a staff of office. The hum of the machine seemed to fade. The frantic energy of the room seemed to bend around his sudden, profound stillness. For the first time, the invisible man was seen, and in his eyes, there was not the look of a janitor, but the cold, appraising gaze of a scientist who had just been presented with a unique and fascinating specimen. He did not move immediately. For a long, suspended moment, Mateo Vargas remained a statue carved from silence and sorrow, the coarse wooden handle of the mop feeling as familiar and solid in his hands as a scepter. The word filth echoed in the pristine, cavernous space of his mind, not as a fresh wound, but as the turning of a key in a lock that had been sealed for a decade.
It was the same word, spoken with the same casual, soul-crushing disdain that the corporate liaisons had used in their reports to dismiss the concerns of his village elders. They had called the sacred Rio Claro a filthy stream, a convenient conduit for their industrial refuse. They had called the ancient forest, a living pharmacy of irreplaceable biodiversity, a filthy patch of jungle. They had called his people, with their songs and their stories and their centuries of accumulated wisdom, a filthy, backward tribe standing in the way of progress. The word was not an insult, it was a verdict, a justification for erasure. And as it hung in the sterile air of the penthouse suite, it did not break him. Instead, it completed him, forging the final link in a chain of grief and fury that stretched back to the day the river ran gray. A profound, almost supernatural calm washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of fear and replacing them with a cold, clear sense of purpose. He lowered the mop. The movement was not hurried or defiant, but deliberate, imbued with a strange and solemn grace. The soft, rubberized head of the tool met the polished marble floor with a quiet, definitive thud, a sound that was somehow louder and more arresting than all the frantic beeping of the machines and the panicked whispers of the medical staff combined. It was the sound of a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. It was the sound of a line being drawn. Every head in the room, which had been so carefully and professionally ignoring his presence, now swiveled in his direction. The doctors, their faces etched with the strain of their losing battle, looked at him with a mixture of annoyance and bewilderment. Falcone's suited men, who had been pacing like caged wolves near the door, froze mid-stride, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. They saw a janitor who had forgotten his place, a piece of furniture that had suddenly decided to move on its own. They saw a disruption, an anomaly in their carefully controlled world. They did not see the tectonic shift that had just occurred beneath the surface, the awakening of a power they could not possibly comprehend. They only saw the uniform, the symbol of his supposed insignificance, and in that moment, their blindness was absolute. Then he spoke. The voice that emerged from him was not the quiet, deferential murmur of the man who cleaned their floors. It was a voice that held the resonance of a lecture hall, the clarity of a scientific treatise, and the weight of ancestral memory. It was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of the emotion that had just been raging within him. It cut through the tense atmosphere of the room like a scalpel. The venom of the Oscura, he said, his gaze fixed not on the doctors, but directly on the dying, furious eyes of Don Lorenzo Falcone, is harmless to my people. The words fell into the silence with the impact of stones dropped into a deep, still well. They were simple, direct, and, in the context of this room, a place that represented the zenith of modern medical science, they were utterly insane. A statement of such profound impossibility that for a second, no one even knew how to react. It was as if the marble floor itself had suddenly offered a medical opinion. The chief of medicine, a man who had authored textbooks on toxicology, could only stare, his mouth slightly agape, the godlike certainty he wore like a tailored suit, beginning to fray at the edges. Falcone's men exchanged confused, wary glances, wondering if the janitor had finally snapped under the pressure. But Matea was not finished. He took a single step forward, away from the wall he had been pressed against, away from the shadows that had been his sanctuary. He stepped into the cold, bright light of the suite, and it felt as though he were stepping onto a stage that had been waiting for him his entire life. The people of the Valle de la Sombra, he continued, his voice maintaining its unnervingly placid tone, have a unique relationship with the flora and fauna of the region. We have coexisted with the Vipera Oscura for centuries. Through generations of exposure, our bloodline has developed a complete genetic immunity. It is not a resistance, it is an anomaly. Our bodies do not simply fight the neurotoxin, they neutralize it. Our blood itself is the antidote. He delivered the explanation with the detached precision of a scholar, each word carefully chosen, each fact laid out with irrefutable logic. In that instant, The illusion of the humble janitor shattered completely, disintegrating into a million pieces. In its place stood Dr. Mateo Vargas, the ethnobotanist, the prodigy, the keeper of a secret that was now the single most valuable commodity on the planet. The power dynamic in the room did not just shift, it inverted with the violence of a collapsing star. The silence that followed was a living thing, a palpable presence that pressed in on them from all sides. It was a silence filled with the frantic, unspoken calculations of men whose entire worldview had just been upended. The chief of medicine was the first to process the impossible truth, his scientific mind racing to connect the dots, to find a rational framework for the miracle that was standing before him in a janitor's uniform. He saw not a peasant, but a biological Rosetta Stone, a key to a medical breakthrough beyond his wildest dreams. Falcone's men saw something far simpler, a lifeline. Their desperate hope, which had been extinguished moments before, was suddenly and violently reignited. But it was Falcone himself whose reaction was the most profound. Lying on his gurney, his body a prison of encroaching paralysis, his mind was a maelstrom of warring emotions. There was terror, the raw, primal fear of a man staring into the abyss. There was disbelief, the refusal of an ego as vast as his fortune to accept that his salvation lay in the hands of the creature he had just dismissed as filth. And beneath it all, there was the familiar, instinctual surge of command, the lifelong reflex of a man who solved every problem by either buying it or crushing it. His arrogance won the battle. His voice, though weak and strained, was laced with the iron of his indomitable will. He did not ask for help. He did not plead for his life. He attempted to issue a command from his deathbed. "Name your price, peasant," he rasped, the insult still clinging to his tongue like the poison in his veins. "1 million? 5 million. Just get it done. Now save me." The words were a grotesque parody of a business negotiation, an attempt to reduce the sacred, life-giving properties of Mateo's blood to a simple line item on a balance sheet. He was trying to reassert control, to drag this surreal, terrifying situation back onto the familiar ground of commerce and coercion. He was not asking for a favor. He was attempting to purchase a service provider.
He saw Mateo not as a savior, but as an asset whose value had suddenly and inconveniently skyrocketed. The offer was not a plea for mercy, but an act of aggression, a final, desperate attempt to prove that even in the face of death, his money made him master of the universe and everyone in it. The word peasant struck Mateo for a second time, but now it carried no sting. It was merely data, a confirmation of the hypothesis he had already formed about the man before him. He saw the desperate, pathetic nature of the offer, the way Falcone clung to the only form of power he had ever understood. Mateo's mind, now operating with the cold clarity of a chess grandmaster, processed the variables. He thought of the elders, living on the meager funds he sent them, a few $100s at a time. $5 million could build them a new village, provide them with health care, give them security and dignity for the rest of their lives. It was a fortune beyond his wildest imaginings. He could taste the possibility of it, the sweet relief it would bring. But then, another image flooded his consciousness, sharp and overwhelming. He saw his sister, Elena, her small body racked with convulsions, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps. He remembered the helpless agony of watching the light fade from her eyes, a light that no amount of money in the world could ever rekindle. What was the price of a life? What was the price of a river, of a forest, of an entire culture erased from the earth? Mateo's silence was his answer. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, his gaze unwavering. He did not acknowledge the offer. He did not nod or shake his head or show any sign that he had even registered the astronomical sum that had been thrown at his feet. His stillness was a form of defiance more powerful than any angry outburst could ever be.
It was a quiet, absolute rejection of Falcone's entire value system. It communicated a truth that the dying man was incapable of grasping, that there were things in this world that were not for sale, that dignity had no price, that the life of his sister was not a commodity to be bartered. This silent refusal infuriated Falcone more than a direct denial. It was a challenge to his very essence, a denial of the core belief that had governed his entire existence. The idea that his wealth, the source of all his power and identity, was meaningless in this moment was a horror far greater than the poison working its way through his system. It was an existential threat, and he reacted with the feral rage of a cornered animal. His face, already ashen, contorted into a mask of pure fury. "If you don't save me," he snarled, his voice cracking with the effort, "I will destroy you. I will find every last one of your pathetic relatives, every one of your dirt-poor friends, and I will grind them into dust under my heel. Do you hear me? I will erase your entire worthless existence from this earth." It was the only way he knew how to negotiate, with the blunt instrument of terror. He was trying to find a leverage point, a currency that this strange, inscrutable man would understand. If money wouldn't work, then fear would have to suffice. He was promising to visit upon Mateo's surviving loved ones the same casual annihilation he had already inflicted upon the Valle de la Sombra. He was, in his desperation, confessing to his own nature, revealing the monstrous depths of his soul without even realizing it. He was confirming from Mateo that this was not a man capable of redemption, but a force of pure, unadulterated destruction that needed to be stopped. The threat did not frighten Mateo. It solidified his resolve into something as hard and as sharp as diamond. The chief of medicine, seeing his one chance at a medical miracle and the survival of his hospital's most important patron slipping away, decided to intervene. He stepped between the two men, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Sir," he said to Mateo, his voice now filled with a desperate respect that bordered on reverence, "please, we need you. Whatever your personal feelings, a man's life is at stake. We can arrange the procedure immediately. We can ensure you are compensated beyond your wildest dreams." He was trying to be the voice of reason, the mediator who could bridge the chasm between the dying king and the silent janitor. But he too misunderstood the nature of the transaction. He still believed this was about compensation, about negotiation. He could not see that he was a mere bystander in a morality play that had begun decades ago, in a valley he had never heard of, and whose final act was now unfolding in his sterile, gilded theater. He was trying to solve a medical problem, while Mateo was preparing to deliver a long overdue sentence. Mateo finally broke his silence, but he did not address the dying man who had threatened him or the doctor who had pleaded with him. He spoke to the room at large, his voice once again assuming the tone of a clinician taking charge of a difficult case. His gaze swept over the array of sophisticated medical equipment, his expert eye assessing the situation with a speed and confidence that left the assembled medical team in stunned silence. "A direct blood transfusion is the only viable method," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a diagnosis. "The neutralizing agents in my blood are complex protein structures.
They will not survive the process of separation and refinement required to create a serum in time. The half-life of the neurotoxin is too short. We need to establish a direct, continuous circuit." He was not just providing the cure, he was dictating the exact terms of its application, seizing control of the medical narrative with an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. He had just demoted every high-priced specialist in the room to the role of his assistant. The implication of his words slowly dawned on everyone, most of all Falcone. A direct transfusion. It was an image of horrifying intimacy. Not a clean, sterile injection of a synthesized antidote, but a direct mingling of their life forces. The idea of this peasant's blood, this filth's blood, flowing directly into his own veins, purifying his system, was a violation more profound than the snakebite itself. It was a humiliation of the highest order, a forced dependency that stripped him of his last shred of autonomy and pride. It was a physical manifestation of his complete and utter powerlessness. The thought was so repulsive to him, so fundamentally offensive to his sense of self, that it momentarily eclipsed his fear of death. He would rather die than suffer the indignity of being saved in such a grotesque, intimate manner by a man he considered to be less than human. The revulsion and rage warring within him created a perfect storm of impotent fury. "Get him out!" Falcone shrieked, the sound tearing from his throat, raw and ragged. He gestured weakly with a trembling hand, a pathetic parody of his usual imperious command. "Fire him! Get him out of my sight! I'll pay any price, fly in any expert from anywhere in the world, but I will not be defiled by this thing." His mind had snapped. The cognitive dissonance was too great to bear. He was choosing what he believed to be certain death over the ultimate humiliation. His security detail, trained to obey his every command without question, finally moved. Two large men in dark suits stepped forward, their faces grim and determined. They flanked Matteo, their hands reaching for his arms. The doctors began to protest, their voices a rising chorus of panicked disbelief, shouting that he was Falcone's only chance, that he was throwing his life away. But the guards ignored them. Their loyalty was to the man, not to his logic or his well-being. Their job was to follow orders, and the order had been given with the last ounce of Falcone's strength. Matteo did not resist. He offered no struggle as the guard's strong hands gripped his arms. He allowed himself to be led from the room, his face a perfect mask of calm composure. As they pulled him through the doorway, he cast one last look back at Don Lorenzo Falcone. He saw a man drowning in his own pride, a man so consumed by his hatred and arrogance that he was actively choosing oblivion over a life that would be indebted to an inferior. In that final glance, Matteo understood everything he needed to know. This was not a negotiation that could be won with words or reason. This was a war that would have to be won through strategy and pressure. As the heavy doors of the penthouse suite swung shut behind him, sealing him off from the scene of his own dismissal, a strange, grim smile touched his lips. Falcone thought he had just won a victory, that he had banished the filth and preserved his pride. He had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had let the antidote walk out the door. The hallway outside the suite was a world away. The air was still and silent, the thick carpets muffling the sound of his footsteps as the guards escorted him toward the service elevator. The pneumatic hiss of the closing doors behind him was a sound of absolute finality. He was officially unemployed. The steady stream of money he sent to the surviving elders of his village, the sole purpose that had given his diminished life meaning for the past 10 years, was gone. The weight of that reality pressed down on him, a physical force that made his shoulders ache. He had stood up to the monster. He had spoken his truth. But what had it cost him? He had won a moral victory in a room where morality was a foreign concept, and in doing so, he had potentially condemned the last remnants of his people to a life of even greater hardship. For a moment, a wave of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. Had he just sacrificed their future for his own pride? He leaned against the cool, polished wood of the corridor wall as the guards left him, their duty done. He was alone with the consequences of his actions. The ghost of Elena's face floated in his mind's eye, her expression not proud, but worried. He had always tried to live a life that would honor her memory, a life of quiet dignity and selfless service to what was left of their family. But what he had just done felt reckless, selfish. He had challenged a king, and the king had cast him out. He closed his eyes, the sterile hospital smell filling his nostrils, and he felt utterly, hopelessly lost. He was just one man, a ghost in the machine, and he had just picked a fight with the machine itself. The despair was a cold, heavy blanket, threatening to suffocate him, to convince him to simply walk away, to disappear back into the shadows and accept his defeat.
It was the voice of a decade of learned helplessness, the instinct of a refugee who knew that survival often meant making oneself as small and as quiet as possible. He pushed himself off the wall and began the long walk toward the employee locker rooms, his footsteps echoing in the deserted corridor. He passed by the other wings of the hospital, the areas for people with normal insurance, for people who paid their bills in installments instead of endowments. He saw the tired, anxious faces of families huddled together in waiting rooms, their expressions a universal language of fear and hope. He saw a young mother gently stroking the forehead of her feverish child. He saw an elderly man holding his wife's hand, his knuckles white with tension. He saw real life, real suffering, real love. It was a world away from the gilded cage he had just left, where a man was willing to die rather than be touched by someone he considered beneath him. The contrast was stark, and it was clarifying. It reminded him of what was truly at stake, not just for him, but for everyone who was considered disposable by men like Falcone. His fight was not just his own. His despair began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning ember of righteous anger. He realized that Falcone's decision was not an act of strength, but of profound weakness. The man was so trapped within the prison of his own arrogance that he could not see the lifeline floating right in front of him. He was a slave to his own mythology. And Matteo knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not the end. A man like Falcone, for all his bluster, did not truly want to die. His love of power was intrinsically tied to his love of life. Sooner or later, as the poison continued its inexorable march through his nervous system, as the darkness closed in, his survival instinct would overwhelm his pride. And when that happened, he would not send the doctors, he would not send the lawyers. He would send his wolves, the men in the dark suits, to find the janitor and drag him back, on any terms necessary. The game was not over. Falcone had simply made his move, and now it was Matteo's turn. He reached the locker room, a cramped, windowless space that smelled of damp towels and industrial-strength disinfectant. It was the backstage area of the hospital's grand performance, the place where the invisible people put on and took off their costumes. He opened his locker, the squeak of the metal door a familiar grating sound. He methodically began to change out of his janitor's uniform, the simple gray shirt and pants that had been his skin for so many years. He folded the garments neatly, a force of habit from a lifetime of meticulous work. But this time, the act felt different. It was not the end of a shift, it was a shedding of a disguise. With each button he unfastened, he felt as though he were reclaiming a piece of his old self, the man he had been before the world had forced him into this role. He was peeling off the camouflage that had kept him safe, but had also kept him silent for far too long. He was no longer hiding. As he pulled on his own worn clothes, a simple pair of jeans and a faded t-shirt from his university, his mind was already working, formulating a strategy. The initial shock and despair had been burned away, leaving behind a core of cold, hard resolve. He was no longer thinking like a victim. He was thinking like a scientist planning an experiment, like a hunter setting a trap. He knew he had a limited amount of time before Falcone's men began their search. He could not go back to his small apartment. He could not use his cell phone or his credit cards. He had to disappear from the grid, to become a ghost once more, but this time, a ghost who was actively haunting his target. He had to control the terms of their next encounter. He held all the cards. The antidote was in his veins, and the knowledge of Falcone's ultimate weakness was in his mind. He just needed to find a way to play his hand without getting crushed in the process. His mission had crystallized, becoming terrifyingly clear. This was no longer just about getting justice for the Valle de la Sombra. It was about leveraging the immediate crisis to expose the historical one. He had to save Falcone's life, but not as an act of mercy. He had to save him as an act of strategic warfare. He needed Falcone alive to face justice. He needed him alive to confess. A dead Lorenzo Falcone would become a martyr to his followers, his crimes buried with him. A living, disgraced Lorenzo Falcone, brought down by the very man he had tried to erase, was a symbol. It was a story of karmic retribution so perfect, so potent, that it could not be ignored. Matteo's goal was no longer simply to survive.
or even to provide for the elders. His goal was to orchestrate the complete and total downfall of the Falcone Empire, using his own blood as the catalyst. He gathered his few personal belongings from the locker. There was not much. A well-worn textbook on Amazonian ethnobotany, its pages filled with his own handwritten notes in the margins. A small laminated photograph of a smiling young girl with a crown of wild orchids in her hair. He traced the outline of Elena's face with his thumb, the plastic cool against his skin. "This is for you," he thought, the words a silent vow. "This is for our river. This is for our people." The photograph was not a source of sadness anymore.
It was a source of strength, a compass pointing him toward his true north. He tucked it carefully into his wallet. He was no longer Mateo Vargas, the janitor, a man defined by what he had lost. He was Mateo Vargas, the Avenger, a man defined by what he was about to do. The transformation was complete. He walked out of the hospital's service entrance and into the cool night air of the city. The endless canyons of glass and steel, which had once seemed so oppressive and alien, now looked like a new kind of jungle, a new ecosystem with its own predators and prey. He was no longer the frightened animal hiding in the undergrowth. He was the viper, perfectly adapted to his environment, patient and ready to strike. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was not fear, it was the electrifying sensation of a man who had finally found his purpose. He knew the path ahead was fraught with danger. Falcone's reach was long, and his methods were brutal. But for the first time in a decade, Mateo was not running from his past. He was running toward a confrontation, armed with the truth as his weapon and justice as his shield. He made his way through the bustling city streets, a man with no name and no resources, but with a plan taking shape in his mind. He needed an ally, someone outside the world of medicine and crime, someone who could wield the truth once he had extracted it. His mind sifted through the ghosts of his past, the contacts from his academic life before it had been so violently cut short. Most were gone, scattered to other universities, other countries. But one name surfaced from the depths of his memory, a name associated with integrity and a fierce. The city became a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, a concrete jungle where Mateo Vargas was now the most endangered of species. He moved through its veins not as a citizen, but as a fugitive, his every instinct honed for survival. The bustling anonymity of the crowds, once a source of crushing loneliness, was now his most effective camouflage. He learned the rhythm of the city's forgotten spaces, the hushed, dusty aisles of the 24-hour public libraries where the homeless sought refuge from the cold, the echoing, cavernous halls of Grand Central Station during the pre-dawn hours, and the narrow, winding alleys of the Lower East Side that smelled of rain-soaked cardboard and fried dumplings. He subsisted on cash, buying single slices of pizza from street vendors and day-old bread from bakeries, ensuring no electronic trail could betray his location. Every man in a dark suit sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Every passing black sedan made the muscles in his back tighten into knots. He was being hunted, he knew, by men who operated outside the law, men for whom a human life was just another business expense to be written off. He was a ghost, but he was a ghost with a mission, a singular, burning objective that eclipsed his fear and his hunger. Find Julian Croft. He remembered Julian Croft not as a face, but as a voice that had cut through the polite, deferential hum of a university symposium on environmental policy years ago. While other academics spoke in carefully worded abstracts and theoretical models, Croft, then a young firebrand investigative journalist invited to speak on the panel, had spoken of real-world consequences. He spoke of corporate malfeasance not as a statistic, but a crime with victims, with names and faces. Mateo, then a promising PhD candidate in the audience, had been captivated by the man's raw, unvarnished passion for truth. A passion that felt increasingly rare in a world of compromised ethics and sponsored research.
Croft had been the one journalist who had shown a fleeting interest in Mateo's preliminary research on the Valle de la Sombra, seeing it not as an academic curiosity, but a potential story of a unique culture under threat from industrial encroachment. They had spoken only once, a brief, intense conversation over stale coffee and muffins, but the memory of Croft's integrity had been a small, flickering candle in the long, dark decade that followed. Now, that faint memory was his only hope, his only potential bridge from the world of shadows back into the world of light and consequence. The search was a painstaking analog process in a digital age. Using the antiquated, slow-as-molasses computers in the public library, his face obscured by the hood of a borrowed sweatshirt, Mateo began to dig. He could not simply search for the man's current whereabouts. That would leave a digital footprint his hunters could easily follow. Instead, he engaged in a form of forensic archaeology, tracing the faint echoes of Croft's career. He found bylines from a decade ago in major newspapers, then a series of increasingly aggressive freelance articles on environmental crime syndicates that appeared on more obscure independent news sites. The trail grew colder, the articles less frequent, until it seemed to disappear altogether around 5 years ago. A knot of dread tightened in Mateo's stomach. Had Falcone's reach extended to Croft as well? Had the journalist been silenced, either through intimidation or something more permanent? Mateo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's overzealous air conditioning.
He was not just looking for an ally. He was following the path of a man who had made a career out of antagonizing monsters, and that path was littered with casualties. It was a stark reminder of the immense power he was challenging, a power that could swallow a man whole and leave not even a ripple behind. He finally found a clue, not in a news article, but in the comments section of an old, forgotten blog post about corporate whistleblowers. A user, under a pseudonym, mentioned a journalist named Croft who had gone to ground after a particularly dangerous investigation into a chemical shipping conglomerate. The commenter lamented that Croft was now self-publishing a small, subscription-based newsletter, a tiny Samizdat operation run from the shadows, a far cry from his former prominence. The comment included a cryptic, non-functional email address, a puzzle of substituted characters and symbols. For anyone else, it would have been a dead end. But for Mateo, whose mind was trained to see patterns in the complex tapestry of the natural world, it was a cipher waiting to be solved. He spent hours staring at the string of characters, his brain working with the same focused intensity he once used to classify undiscovered species of orchids. He saw the botanical references, the subtle nods to Linnaean taxonomy hidden within the jumble. It was a code designed to be read by someone who spoke the language of science. After 3 hours of focused effort, he unscrambled it. He had the email address. He had a way in. The reply came 27 agonizing hours later. It was brief, paranoid, and dismissive. "I don't know who you are or what you're talking about. Leave me alone." It was the response of a man who had been burned too many times, a man who saw a potential threat in every unsolicited contact. But embedded in the email's metadata, in the digital signature of the server it was routed through, was a single, tiny anomaly. A geographical tag, almost certainly left by accident, pointing to an internet cafe in the Bronx. It was a mistake, a flicker of carelessness from a man who had otherwise perfected the art of digital invisibility. For Mateo, it was everything. He knew he had one chance, one opportunity to turn this digital ghost into a flesh and blood ally. He could not reply to the email. Croft would simply block him and vanish again. He had to go there in person. He had to step out of the shadows and risk everything on a single face-to-face encounter, hoping that the man he remembered was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the layers of cynicism and fear. The journey uptown on the subway was the longest of his life, each stop an eternity, each new passenger a potential threat. He found Julian Croft in a dimly lit apartment above a bustling Dominican bakery, a space that smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and the faint, metallic scent of ozone from aging computer equipment. The man who answered the door was a ghost of a different kind.
The fire Mateo remembered was gone from his eyes, replaced by a weary, haunted resignation. His shoulders were slumped, his face was etched with the deep lines of a man who had stared into the abyss for too long and had seen the abyss stare back. He was thin, wired, and his eyes, when they landed on Mateo, were filled with a hostile, cornered suspicion. He tried to slam the door, but Mateo was faster, his hand shooting out to block it, his voice low and urgent. "My name is Mateo Vargas. We met 10 years ago. At the symposium, I was studying the ethnobotany of the Valle de la Sombra." He saw a flicker of recognition in Croft's eyes, a dusty memory being pulled from a long-forgotten file. The name of the valley was the key. It was the one thing that connected them, the one piece of shared history that could bridge the gap of a lost decade. Croft let him in, but the hostility remained, a palpable force field around him. He listened to Mateo's story with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of profound skepticism. He paced the small, cluttered room, which was lined with overflowing filing cabinets and corkboards covered in a chaotic web of newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes, connected by colored string. It was the den of a man obsessed, a man fighting a war that had already consumed him. As Mateo spoke, detailing the events in the hospital, the snake, Falcone's arrogance, and the unique properties of his own blood, Croft's expression shifted from disbelief to a kind of weary pity. "Kid," he said, his voice raspy from too many cigarettes and too little sleep, "you have no idea what you're up against. You think you have leverage? Lorenzo Falcone doesn't have leverage points. He has event horizons. You get too close, you just disappear. He's not a man, he's a corporation with a heartbeat. He's a walking, talking shell company. You can't beat him, you can only run." It was the voice of a defeated soldier trying to warn a new recruit away from a battle he knew was unwinnable. But Mateo did not back down. He stood his ground in the center of the cluttered room, his presence a small island of calm in Croft's storm of cynical despair. He looked the journalist in the eye, and for the first time, he let the full weight of his own story unfold. He did not speak of vengeance or of justice in grand abstract terms. He spoke of his sister, Elena. He described the way she used to hum the harvest song while weaving flowers into her hair. He described the metallic, chemical smell of the river on the day it died. He described the helpless, gut-wrenching agony of watching her take her final, shallow breath, her small body poisoned by a man who had never even known her name. He painted a picture of his lost world with such vivid, heartbreaking detail that it ceased to be a story and became a living, breathing tragedy in the small, dusty apartment. He was not asking for a journalist to cover a story. He was asking for a human being to bear witness to a crime, to help him give a name to the ghosts that haunted him. He was offering Croft not a headline, but a chance at redemption, a chance to fight one more battle that actually mattered. The transformation in Julian Croft was slow but profound. As Mateo spoke, the layers of cynicism began to peel away, like rust being scraped from old iron. The weary resignation in his eyes was slowly, almost imperceptibly, replaced by the faint, flickering embers of the fire Mateo remembered from a decade ago. He stopped pacing and sank into a worn office chair, his gaze fixed on Mateo, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw not a naive victim, but a survivor with a core of unbreakable steel. He saw a weapon that Falcone, in his infinite arrogance, had completely failed to recognize. The story was not just good, it was perfect. It was a David and Goliath narrative for a cynical age, a story of poetic, almost biblical justice. It was the kind of story that could not only expose a crime, but could capture the imagination of the world, the kind of story that could actually change things. It was the one story, he realized, that might just be worth the risk, the one fight that might just be winnable. For the first time in years, Julian Croft felt a forgotten sensation stirring in his gut. Hope. The war room was born. The chaotic apartment became the nerve center of a two-man insurgency against a global empire. The first step was to establish a secure line of communication and a base of operations that Falcone's digital bloodhounds could not trace. Croft, dusting off his old skills, guided Matteo through the labyrinth of the dark web, teaching him how to use encrypted networks and anonymous browsers, how to become a true ghost in the machine. They worked with a feverish intensity, fueled by endless pots of thick black coffee and a shared, unspoken understanding that the clock was ticking. Falcone would not remain in the hospital forever. They had a finite window of opportunity to find the evidence they needed before he was discharged and surrounded once more by the impenetrable fortress of his wealth and power. Their objective was simple and seemingly impossible: to find a definitive, legally binding link between Lorenzo Falcone himself and the shell corporation, Apex Chemical Disposal, that had signed the death warrant for the Valle de la Sombra over a decade ago. They were looking for a single, buried document, a needle in a haystack of global corporate malfeasance. The initial days of the investigation were a descent into a maddening, labyrinthine hell of corporate bureaucracy. They waded through oceans of digital paperwork, from shell company registrations in the Cayman Islands to falsified environmental impact reports filed in Panama. Falcone's empire was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, a hydra with 1,000 heads, each one designed to sever the connection between his name and the dirty work that funded his lavish lifestyle. For every corporate veil they managed to pierce, they found 3 more layered underneath. It was a fortress of lies, built by the most expensive lawyers and accountants money could buy, and it seemed utterly impenetrable. Frustration began to mount. Matteo, used to the clear, elegant logic of the natural world, found the arbitrary, deceitful complexity of corporate law to be a suffocating poison. He felt like he was punching at smoke, his efforts swallowed by the vast, indifferent machinery of a system designed to protect men like Falcone. The hope that had ignited in the apartment began to flicker, threatening to be extinguished by the sheer, overwhelming scale of their enemy's defenses. Croft, however, was in his element. He had navigated these treacherous waters before, and he knew that every fortress, no matter how imposing, had a weakness. And the weakness of any organization built on secrets and lies was always the same: people. "You don't attack the walls," he told Matteo, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light as he scrolled through a list of Apex Chemical's former board members. "You find the disgruntled gatekeeper, the man who was paid to look the other way, the one who knows where the bodies are buried because he helped dig the graves." Their focus shifted from documents to people. They began to build a profile of the men who had run Apex Chemical in its final days, just before it was conveniently dissolved and its records supposedly destroyed in a mysterious warehouse fire. They were looking for a weak link, a man who might have a conscience, or, more likely, a grudge. They were looking for a ghost from Falcone's past who might be willing to talk in exchange for immunity or revenge. Their search led them to a name: Arthur Kendrick. He had been the chief logistics officer for Apex, the man responsible for overseeing the transport and disposal of the chemical waste. According to the sparse records they could find, he had been forced into an early retirement shortly after the Valle de la Sombra contract, a move that seemed suspiciously like a golden handshake to ensure his silence. He had since dropped off the map, living a quiet, unassuming life in a small, sleepy town in upstate New York. He was their man. He was the gatekeeper. The problem was getting to him. Falcone would undoubtedly have him under some form of surveillance, a quiet, invisible leash to ensure his continued loyalty. A direct approach was impossible. They needed a way to get to Kendrick without alerting Falcone's network that they were even looking. They needed a disguise, a pretext, a way for Matteo to approach him that would not raise any red flags. The hunter needed to become the bait. The plan they devised was simple, elegant, and deeply dangerous. Matteo, using his expert knowledge of botany, would pose as a graduate student from a local university, conducting a survey of invasive plant species in the region. It was a perfect cover. It was academic, non-threatening, and gave him a legitimate reason to be wandering around the remote, wooded area where Kendrick lived. It utilized Matteo's own genuine expertise, making his performance utterly convincing. Croft, meanwhile, would act as his digital overwatch, creating a believable online presence for the fictional student, complete with a university email address and a faculty advisor page on a dummy website. It was a meticulous deception, a carefully constructed reality designed to fool a man who was likely trained to spot threats. Mateo spent days memorizing maps of the area, studying the local flora, and rehearsing his cover story until it felt as natural as his own name. He was stepping back into the role of a scientist, but this time his field of study was not the secrets of nature, but the dark, twisted heart of a single, frightened man. As Mateo prepared for his mission, the world outside their small apartment began to close in. The pressure from Falcone's network was escalating. One of Croft's longtime confidential sources, a low-level clerk in the city's records office, called him in a panic, whispering that men with Falcone's security firm had been asking questions, sniffing around old corporate filings. The next day, the source's number was disconnected. Then a black town car, the same model used by Falcone's entourage, was spotted parked across the street from Croft's building for an entire afternoon, its tinted windows like the blank, unblinking eyes of a shark. It was a message, a silent, implicit threat. They knew someone was digging. They didn't know who or where, but the beast had been alerted and it was beginning to stir. The sense of urgency in the apartment became a palpable living thing, a constant, low-grade hum of adrenaline. Mateo knew that when he went upstate to find Kendrick, he would not just be walking into a stranger's life, he would be walking into the lion's den. The meeting with Arthur Kendrick took place on a crisp autumn afternoon on a hiking trail that bordered the old man's secluded property. Mateo, dressed in hiking gear and carrying a surveyor's notebook, played his part to perfection. He found Kendrick tending to his garden, his hands covered in dirt. The man was a shadow of the corporate executive he once was, his face worn with a quiet, gnawing anxiety that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. He was jumpy, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line, a man living in a self-imposed prison of fear. Mateo approached him cautiously, launching into his well-rehearsed speech about cataloging Japanese knotweed. At first, Kendrick was dismissive, eager to be left alone. But Mateo was patient. He did not press the man about his past. Instead, he engaged him on the one subject where Kendrick seemed to feel safe, his garden. Mateo identified a rare native orchid growing near the man's prized rose bushes, complimenting him on his cultivation skills and sharing a piece of obscure botanical knowledge. He was building a bridge, a fragile connection based on a shared, simple love for the natural world. Over the course of an hour, as they spoke of soil acidity and pruning techniques, Mateo saw the walls around Kendrick begin to crumble. He saw the profound loneliness of a man who had been living with a terrible secret for over a decade. He saw a man desperate to connect with someone, anyone who did not represent the darkness of his past. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the garden, Mateo made his move. He steered the conversation gently, seamlessly, from the blight affecting Kendrick's roses to the man-made blights that poison the earth. And then he spoke the name, Valle de la Sombra. He said it softly, not as an accusation, but as a lament. He watched as every ounce of color drained from Kendrick's face. The old man's hands began to tremble, and he looked at Mateo with eyes that were wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, heartbreaking flicker of relief. The secret, it seemed, had been a burden too heavy to carry alone. Kendrick did not confess immediately. He retreated into a shell of panicked denial, but the seed had been planted. Mateo left him with a single, untraceable burner phone, telling him that it was a chance to finally do the right thing, to unburden his soul. For 2 days, there was nothing but silence. Mateo and Croft waited in a state of suspended agony, the fate of their entire operation resting on the conscience of one broken man. They feared that Kendrick would call his old masters, that Falcone's enforcers would descend upon them at any moment. The strain was immense, the silence stretching their nerves to the breaking point. And then, on the third night, the burner phone rang. Kendrick's voice was a choked whisper, the sound of a man who had wrestled with his demons and lost, or perhaps had finally won. He wouldn't testify, he said. He was too afraid for his family. But he would give them something better. He would give them the key. The key was a number, not a phone number or a bank account, but the number of a long-forgotten, climate-controlled storage unit in a disused warehouse district in Queens, registered under his deceased mother's name. In that unit, he explained, was his personal insurance policy, a single leather-bound ledger. It was the original handwritten shipping and disposal log from his time at Apex Chemical. It contained every detail of the Valle de la Sombra contract, including dates, chemical formulas, and most importantly, a final sign-off page for high-risk disposals that required executive authorization. He told them to look at the entry for October 17th, more than a decade ago. There, he said, his voice cracking with the weight of his betrayal, you will find the signature. Not a rubber stamp, not a proxy, the man himself. He insisted on it. He wanted to see the ink on the page, his initials, LF. It was the smoking gun. It was the irrefutable proof that tied the king to the crime. It was the key that would unlock the final confrontation. The retrieval of the ledger was an operation of surgical precision and nerve-shattering tension. Croft, using his network of contacts, managed to get them access to the storage facility after hours, bribing a night watchman who was willing to look the other way for a few $100s. Mateo went in alone, moving through the cavernous, echoing rows of metal doors like a wraith. The air was cold and smelled of dust and decay, a mausoleum of forgotten possessions and buried secrets. He found the unit, the lock stiff and rusted from years of disuse. He broke it open, his heart hammering against his ribs, every creak of the metal door sounding like a gunshot in the profound silence. Inside, amidst dusty furniture and boxes of old clothes, was a small locked safe. Kendrick had given them the combination. Mateo's hands, usually so steady, trembled as he turned the dial. He swung open the heavy steel door, and there it was, a simple, unassuming black ledger. He opened it, his breath catching in his throat. He flipped through the brittle, yellowed pages until he found the final entry. And there, at the bottom of the page, scrawled in a confident, arrogant hand, were the two letters that would bring an empire to its knees. He walked out of the storage facility and back into the cool night air, the ledger clutched to his chest like a sacred text. He held in his hands the physical manifestation of Falcone's sin, the tangible proof that would dismantle the fortress of lies. In the sterile, gilded cage of his hospital suite, Lorenzo Falcone was slowly recovering, his body mending, his arrogance returning. He believed he had won. He believed he had banished the peasant and weathered the storm, that his power and his secrets remained intact. He had no idea that the world outside his window had fundamentally shifted. He did not know that the janitor he had dismissed as filth now held his entire legacy in the palm of his hand. The investigation was over. The hunt was complete. Mateo Vargas now had the weapon he needed. All that remained was to return to the heart of the beast, not as a servant, but as a judge, and deliver the final, long-overdue sentence. The stage for the checkmate was officially set. The grand ballroom of the Falcone Tower was a cathedral built to the god of capital. Sunlight streamed through two-story windows, refracting through a constellation of Swarovski crystal chandeliers and glinting off the polished gold accents of the Corinthian columns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged leather from $100,000 briefcases, and the subtle, unmistakable aroma of power, a scent that was both intoxicating and suffocating. On a raised dais at the center of this universe stood Don Lorenzo Falcone, looking not like a man who had recently been at death's door, but like a titan reborn. His Savvy Row suit was immaculate, his silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, boomed with renewed, arrogant vigor. He was a master of his own mythology, and this room of sycophants and investors was his rapt congregation. In the back of the room, standing quietly near an exit, were two men who did not belong: Julian Croft, his face a mask of grim determination, and Mateo Vargas, dressed not in a uniform, but in a simple, dark suit that seemed to absorb the opulent light around him, rendering him almost invisible once more. But this was a different kind of invisibility. It was the quiet stillness of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The grand ballroom of the Falcone Tower was a cathedral built to the god of capital. Sunlight streamed through two-story windows, refracting through a constellation of Swarovski crystal chandeliers and glinting off the polished gold accents of the Corinthian columns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged leather from $100,000 briefcases, and the subtle, unmistakable aroma of power, a scent that was both intoxicating and suffocating. On a raised dais at the center of this universe stood Don Lorenzo Falcone, looking not like a man who had recently been at death's door, but like a titan reborn. His Savvy Row suit was immaculate, his silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, boomed with renewed arrogant vigor. He was a master of his own mythology, and this room of sycophants and investors was his rapt congregation. In the back of the room, standing quietly near an exit, were two men who did not belong: Julian Croft, his face a mask of grim determination, and Mateo Vargas, dressed not in a uniform, but in a simple dark suit that seemed to absorb the opulent light around him, rendering him almost invisible once more. But this was a different kind of invisibility. It was the quiet stillness of a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
Falcone was reaching the crescendo of his speech, his hands gesturing grandly to a chart on the massive screen behind him projecting record profits. He spoke of legacy, of strength, of the unbreakable will that had built this empire from the ground up. It was at that precise moment of peak hubris that Julian Croft raised his hand, not to ask a question, but to give a signal. A technician, a young man whom Croft had spent weeks cultivating, a man with his own story of being crushed by a Falcone subsidiary, pressed a single button on his console. The profit charts on the screen behind Falcone vanished, replaced by a grainy, static-filled image. A collective, confused murmur rippled through the ballroom. Falcone faltered, his words catching in his throat as he turned to glare at the screen. The image resolved, showing the sterile, white walls of a hospital room. Then, a sound filled the cavernous space, a sound that cut through the atmosphere of wealth and power like a shard of glass. It was the low, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, a sound of profound vulnerability that was utterly alien in this temple of invincibility. And then, a voice, weak and reedy, laced with a terror that no one in this room had ever heard from him before, echoed from the speakers. It was the voice of Lorenzo Falcone, stripped bare of all its power. The audio was raw, unfiltered, and devastatingly clear. The entire room listened in stunned, absolute silence as their leader's voice, small and pathetic, confessed his sins to an unseen inquisitor. He spoke of a remote valley, a worthless patch of land. He spoke of a convenient place to dump industrial poison, a cost-cutting measure that had laid the foundation for the very profits he had just been celebrating. He laughed, a weak, wheezing sound, as he recounted how easy it had been, how nobody had cared about the filthy stream or the backward tribe that lived there. And then another voice entered the recording, calm and steady, speaking in a language no one in the room understood, a language that was soft yet carried the weight of an ancient sorrow. It was Mateo's voice, asking questions they could not comprehend, but whose answers were painting a portrait of a monster. He asked about the river. He asked about the children. He asked about a little girl with a crown of wild orchids in her hair. And Falcone, delirious and desperate, his life literally flowing from the man beside him, answered every question, his words a torrent of casual, soul-crushing cruelty that condemned him more completely than any prosecutor ever could. The recording was not just an admission of a crime, it was the bearing of a soul so devoid of empathy that the air in the ballroom grew cold, the gilded opulence suddenly feeling cheap and tawdry, like a funeral shroud. On the stage, Lorenzo Falcone underwent a final, horrifying transformation. The Titan crumbled. The carefully constructed facade of power and invincibility disintegrated in real time under the hot glare of the spotlights and the cold, accusing stares of his disciples. His face, which had been flushed with triumphant color, became a ghastly, ashen mask.
His body, which had stood so tall and proud, seemed to shrink, his expensive suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for the withered man inside it. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to rage, but only a dry, rattling sound emerged. His own voice, echoing from the speakers, had stolen his. He was a king being executed by his own ghost. As the recording reached its terrible climax, with Falcone admitting he would have poisoned the valley 10 times over for a tenth of the profit, the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 2 men in dark suits and a woman in the crisp uniform of a federal prosecutor stepped inside, their faces grim and resolute. They did not hurry. They walked down the central aisle with a slow, deliberate pace, their footsteps on the marble floor the only sound in the room besides the damning voice from the past. The illusion was shattered. The god was dead. All that was left was a terrified, broken old man waiting for the inevitable. Justice in the comments if you got chills when Lorenzo Falcone's empire finally came crashing down. The fall of the House of Falcone was not an explosion. It was a collapse, a vast, complex structure imploding under the weight of its own corruption, a process set in motion by a single, undeniable truth. The headlines screamed for weeks, a global symphony of corporate disgrace. Federal investigations, shareholder lawsuits, and the testimony of dozens of other victims who came forward in the wake of the revelation dismantled the empire piece by piece until nothing was left but rubble and ruin. Lorenzo Falcone, the man who believed he was above the world, spent his final days in a world defined by concrete walls and iron bars, a gilded cage of a different sort, his health failing, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale of hubris and decay. But for Mateo Vargas, the end of Falcone was not the end of the story. It was not a moment for celebration or for vengeance. It was a moment of profound, quiet release, the unburdening of a weight he had carried in his heart for more than a decade. The justice he had sought was not for himself.
It was a memorial, a final, solemn song for the ghosts of the Valle de la Sombra, for the clear water of the Rio Claro, and for a little sister whose laughter he could finally remember without the suffocating shadow of rage. His story became a legend, a viral sensation that circled the globe, the tale of the invisible man who had brought down a king. Offers poured in from everywhere, book deals, movie rights, interviews with every major news network. He turned them all down. He had not sought the spotlight, only the truth. But one offer was different. It came from a world-renowned philanthropic medical institute, a place dedicated not to profit, but to progress. They were not interested in his story. They were interested in his mind and in his blood. They offered him a fully funded, state-of-the-art laboratory, a team of dedicated researchers, and a chance to restart the PhD that had been stolen from him. They wanted him to continue his life's work, to study the unique genetic gifts of his people, to synthesize the antidote that flowed through his veins, and create a new generation of life-saving medicines. It was not just a job, it was a restoration. It was a chance to transform a legacy of pain into a future of healing, to ensure that the wisdom of his ancestors, which Falcone had tried to erase, would now be a gift to all of humanity. He stands now not in a sterile hospital suite or a dusty apartment, but in a laboratory filled with light and life. The air smells of growing things, of sterilized earth and budding plant specimens from all over the world. He is surrounded by young, brilliant students who hang on his every word, their eyes filled with the same passion for knowledge that had once burned so brightly in him. He is no longer Mateo Vargas, the janitor, the ghost. He is Dr. Mateo Vargas, a leader, a mentor, a pioneer. He has established the Elena Vargas Initiative, a foundation dedicated to finding, studying, and protecting the world's ethnobotanical knowledge, ensuring that no other culture's wisdom is ever dismissed as filth or erased for profit. His journey, born from the deepest personal tragedy, had come full circle. He had faced the monster who had destroyed his past, not with violence, but with truth. He had reclaimed his own future, and in doing so, he had created a new legacy for his people, one of hope, healing, and unbreakable dignity.
His story became a quiet but powerful testament to a simple, profound truth: that the most powerful force on Earth is not wealth or weapons, but the unwavering courage of a single individual who refuses to be forgotten. If Mateo Vargas's incredible journey from an invisible man to an agent of justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that truth can indeed change the world. And for more unforgettable stories of resilience and righteous retribution, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update from our community.